to start early next year.
Question number 9, the Honourable Darren Hughes.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Transport, and it asks, how are last week's transport announcements totally consistent with the statement in the speech from the throne that, quote, of particular focus will be the development of new roading and public transport projects?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to report that they are totally consistent because in the course of last week's announcements we have committed very sizable investments to both. Last week we announced a 31% increase in actual funding for public transport services over actual expenditure for the last 3 years, in addition to a government commitment to provide $750 million worth of electric trains in both Wellington and Auckland. This is on top of the $500 million worth of rail track upgrades that OnTrack is already committed to, and the further $600 million in double tracking of Auckland's rail spent by the previous government. For roading, we have increased funding for new state highway construction by almost $1 billion over the next 3 years and $4.1 billion over the 10-year period.
The Honourable Darren Hughes.
Question. Supplementary, sir. Does the Minister believe that there is a mandate to increase taxes by 6 cents a litre, forcing all New Zealanders to contribute to funding to only part of Auckland's transport needs, a plan that was well developed by local people? And why was such a move not signalled in recent pre-election documents or in the speech from the throne?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, I can report that 3 cents of the 6 cents the member refers to was actually scheduled by the previous government, who scheduled a 4.5 cent a litre increase in national taxes over 3 years, alongside the 9.5 cents they scheduled in Auckland regional fuel taxes. They just forgot to tell Auckland that that added to 14 cents a litre over 3 years.
Nicky Wagner.
Minister of Transport, how does this government's approach contrast to previous approaches to transport funding?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the previous Labor government left office having signed off on a government policy statement that projected a 9% reduction in new state highway construction over the next 3 years. This is despite the fact that 70% of all freight in New Zealand goes by road and about 84% of people go to work by car, truck or motorbike. Labor's slowdown of state highway construction would have occurred at the very time that the economy needed the state highway construction to increase the most.
The Honourable Darren Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, why does he think that Kiwis will accept paying an additional 6 cents a litre to fund his half-baked ideas for Auckland, when his own cabinet papers show that he is cutting the spending of renewal, maintenance and operation of state highways by $123 million and on the same issues for local roads by $75 million? How is that fair?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is we are not cutting expenditure for those items. We are increasing them, just not at quite the same rate that Labor was proposing to increase them, so we can invest more, and in fact $1 billion more, in state highway infrastructure around the country over the next 3 years.
The Honourable Keith Locke.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How many new public transport projects has the Minister announced since he took office, or are they all pre-existing projects, some of whose public funding is now less certain, such as the building of new railway stations in Auckland?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, we have not announced significant new public transport projects. What we have done is change the funding of the Auckland transport funding projects. What we have done is actually focus the transport expenditure to match the modes available to New Zealanders to get to and from work by car, truck, motorcycle, bus or train every day.
The Honourable Darren Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, do the deep cuts to public transport of nearly $500 million over what had been scheduled mean that the prospect of new electric trains working before the Rugby World Cup in 2011 has now disappeared, and that Kiwis and tourists will now have to still fork out for $70 for a taxi ride from the city to the airport?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, the member has two problems with his numbers. I don't know where he gets the $500 million from, and the electric trains were not scheduled to be in by the 2011 World Cup in anybody's imagination except the former member for Otaki's.
Question